Imagine this, a busy, elegant restaurant buzzing with the quiet hum of conversations and the gentle clink of silverware. But then, something shocking happens. A waitress, her face twisted with disdain, approaches a quiet, well-dressed black man sitting alone at a corner table. With cold, deliberate cruelty, she dumps a tray of kitchen waste directly onto his face, her actions fueled by prejudice. But there's one thing she doesn't know. This man isn't just any guest. He's the owner of the restaurant. Before we dive deeper into this intense story, let's take a moment to get to know you, our amazing viewers. Tell us your name and where you're watching from in the comments. We truly appreciate every single one of you. Your comments, likes, and support mean everything to us and help us grow our channel. You're not just viewers, you're a vital part of our community, and we are grateful for each of you. Now, are you ready to uncover what happened next in this unforgettable tale? In the dimly lit dining room of his own restaurant, amidst the soft murmur of guests and the gentle hum of background music, sat a man who appeared unremarkable to anyone else. Dressed simply, with a quiet presence, he blended into the room, deliberately choosing a seat by the window, far from the center, away from the spotlight. This man was no ordinary guest, though. He was the owner of this very establishment, the visionary behind every detail, from the carefully chosen furniture to the signature dishes. Yet tonight, he wanted to remain unknown, just another face in the crowd. He was a tall, distinguished black man with an aura of calm that seemed to blend into his surroundings. Years of hard work and resilience had shaped him, not only as a successful businessman but as a person who had faced countless challenges and defied prejudices to build a legacy. He had started from the ground up, turning this restaurant into a symbol of his perseverance and dedication, a space where people could come together to enjoy not only fine dining but a sense of community. As he settled in, his gaze moved gently around the room, observing the flow of the evening, the warmth of the lighting, and the subtle rhythm of conversations. This was his world, a reflection of his values, but tonight he wanted to experience it as any other guest would. He ordered a modest meal and a glass of wine, not looking for special treatment or recognition, but simply enjoying the space he had created with so much love and intention. Yet, his presence did not go unnoticed. Across the room, a waitress caught sight of him and felt an immediate spark of irritation. The waitress's eyes lingered on him, a flicker of distaste barely hidden beneath her practiced, professional demeanor. She prided herself on her efficiency and dedication, but her attention was often reserved for guests she deemed worthy, those she felt reflected the right kind of clientele for a place like this. This man, quietly seated by the window, dressed simply and blending into the room, immediately struck her as someone who didn't belong. As she observed him, the thoughts circling in her mind grew darker, laced with a deep-seated prejudice she didn't even attempt to question. In her eyes, he seemed out of place, a blemish on the refined environment she felt the restaurant embodied. Her initial discomfort quickly turned into silent disdain, rooted not in anything the man had said or done, but in his appearance alone. The color of his skin, the quiet confidence he held, it stirred something resentful within her, a feeling she barely tried to conceal. Approaching his table, she adjusted her expression to something resembling politeness, yet her body language and the slight edge in her tone betrayed her feelings. She moved with calculated slowness, her posture radiating a subtle hostility, her gaze sharp and uninviting. She stopped by his table, her face barely softening as she spoke. "Good evening. Are you ready to order?" she asked curtly, her voice carrying a thinly veiled frostiness, devoid of the warmth she usually offered her guests. The man, calm and composed, responded politely, ordering his meal with a quiet dignity. His measured tone and gentle demeanor should have softened her attitude, but instead, it only stoked her irritation further. She interpreted his poise as arrogance, his relaxed manner as a challenge to her authority. As she turned away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking right through her, unbothered by her thinly veiled contempt. The man's quiet strength, his indifference to her silent judgment, fueled her irritation even more. In her mind, she had already cast him in a role he didn't deserve, and nothing he did or said would change that now. Through the lens of her prejudice, the waitress began to shape a narrative around this man, entirely disconnected from who he actually was. To her, he wasn't a successful businessman or a man who had poured his heart and soul into creating this very space. Instead, she saw him as an intruder, someone who did not deserve to be seated in the elegant surroundings of the restaurant she worked so hard to uphold. She viewed him as someone who, by merely being there, disrupted her carefully constructed image of what proper guests should look like. Her thoughts grew sharper, harsher. She imagined him as out of place, as someone who, in her mind, surely didn't understand or appreciate the sophistication of the menu, the subtlety of the decor, or the refined ambience she so valued. Her mind filled with assumptions, all stemming from her deeply ingrained biases, assumptions she felt justified in her own twisted logic. To her, he seemed unworthy, his presence an affront to the exclusivity she believed her restaurant represented. Without even realizing it, her actions and words began to change. Her voice grew more dismissive, her responses colder, and her movements around his table calculated to send a message, one that she felt was subtle, yet scathingly clear. Each action she took was colored by a belief that he did not belong there, as if the color of his skin alone was reason enough for her contempt. This internal narrative became a filter through which she viewed every interaction with him. She didn't see the dignity in his gaze, the quiet pride he carried. Instead, she saw what she wanted to see, a man she deemed inferior, someone who, by her estimation, had no right to share in the elegance of the space she held so dear. Every step she took, every word she spoke, was fueled by a prejudice that she justified as intuition or instinct, never questioning the ugliness and unfairness that drove her actions. As the evening wore on, the waitress's quiet disdain turned into simmering suspicion. She found herself unable to look at the man without questioning his motives, his intentions, his very presence in the restaurant. Her mind, clouded by prejudice, began to fabricate reasons to doubt him, as though his mere existence in this refined space required an explanation. In her mind, she constructed scenarios. Perhaps he was here out of place. Maybe he had somehow managed to slip through unnoticed. She imagined that he might be one of those people who didn't truly understand the level of sophistication this restaurant offered, or worse, someone trying to take advantage of it. Her suspicions twisted even mundane details, his simple clothing, his relaxed demeanor, his choice to sit in a quiet corner. Every small action seemed, in her eyes, a confirmation of her biases. When he asked for a simple glass of wine to accompany his meal, she found herself questioning his ability to afford it, even though there was nothing unusual about his request. As she poured, her movements were deliberate and slow, almost as if to give herself time to scrutinize him further, searching for any sign to validate her unfounded suspicions. She imagined that he was watching her in a calculating way, her mind interpreting his calm observance as some sort of challenge, a silent dare. To anyone else, he appeared as a quiet, composed man, enjoying his meal in solitude. But through her clouded vision, the waitress saw only a man who was, in her mind, out of place, even potentially suspicious. Her prejudice twisted her perception, making her see him as an intruder in a space she felt obligated to protect. Each of his actions seemed like confirmation of her biased assumptions, and the air between them thickened with unspoken tension that only she seemed to perceive. As her suspicion deepened, the waitress's attitude shifted further from quiet disdain to open neglect. She began to serve him with a deliberate lack of care, each gesture laden with thinly veiled contempt. Her interactions became curt and dismissive, her tone clipped and impersonal. Where she usually took pride in attentive service, offering wine pairings, explaining the menu with enthusiasm, and checking in on guests with warm smiles, here, she offered none of these gestures. For him, there were no friendly greetings, no polite follow-up questions, no attentive eye on his experience. Instead, he received only the bare minimum, as though she were going through the motions out of obligation rather than genuine service. When he made a simple request for water, she took her time, choosing to prioritize other tables, even if they had not called for her. The man's glass sat empty for long stretches, a subtle but intentional gesture that underscored her disdain. To her, he was invisible, not deserving of the same attentiveness she readily gave to other patrons. She delivered his food without a word, without the usual courtesy of "enjoy your meal," and left the table swiftly, as if his presence was something to be escaped. Her neglect became more apparent as the evening progressed, and she made no effort to hide her lack of interest in his experience. She didn't return to check on his meal or offer any additional service. The deliberate nature of her neglect, the calculated indifference, was her way of communicating that, in her eyes, he wasn't worth her time or effort. She told herself that she was justified in this behavior, convinced that he somehow deserved this cold treatment, though he had done nothing to warrant it. Each dismissive action was a small but pointed way of signaling that she viewed him as less than, unworthy of the respect she freely gave to others. The waitress's contempt deepened to the point where mere neglect no longer felt sufficient. She wanted to send a clearer message, one that would underline her belief that he didn't deserve to be there. With a barely concealed smirk, she decided to tamper with his order, a subtle but unmistakable act of sabotage that would ensure his experience was anything but pleasant. When she took his dish from the kitchen, she deliberately mishandled it. She tilted the plate roughly, causing the carefully arranged food to slide messily to one side, smearing sauces and disrupting the presentation. The once artful plating looked careless and disheveled, nothing like the pristine dishes that were normally set before patrons. Returning to his table, she placed the plate down with a harsh thud, barely sparing him a glance, as though a rough handling of his meal was an accident. She didn't apologize, didn't ask if he needed anything else. Instead, she lingered for just a moment, watching out of the corner of her eye for any hint of discomfort or disappointment that might flicker across his face. Inside, she felt a twisted satisfaction, convinced she'd shown him his place with this subtle act. To her, this wasn't just poor service, it was a deliberate act of disrespect that let her channel her prejudices under the guise of a simple mishap. The disrupted meal, with its unappetizing presentation, felt like the message she wanted to send, a wordless statement of her disdain. And yet, the man didn't react. He accepted the dish with the same calm demeanor, his composure a silent refusal to give her the satisfaction she craved. This quiet resilience only fueled her bitterness, pushing her toward an escalating cycle of contempt that she felt disturbingly justified in pursuing. As the evening unfolded, other patrons began to notice the tension radiating from the corner where the man was seated. Though subtle, the waitress's actions had become unmistakable, a pattern of neglect and quiet hostility that did not go unnoticed by those nearby. Whispered conversations and furtive glances began to pass between tables as guests exchanged uncertain looks, some of them beginning to realize that something was amiss. At first, it was only a few watchful eyes that tracked the waitress's cold demeanor, her clipped tone, and the dismissive way she handled his requests. But as her treatment grew increasingly pointed, more patrons took note. They watched as she ignored his calls for service, as she seemed to purposefully delay returning to his table, and as she left his empty glass untouched despite having walked past it several times. To an outsider, her behavior seemed almost rehearsed, a series of small, calculated slights that added up to something far more insidious. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions revealing discomfort and confusion. A few cast sympathetic glances in the man's direction, as if silently apologizing for the behavior of the waitress. Others watched her with growing disapproval, the collective mood of the room shifting as patrons became aware of the deliberate nature of her neglect. Despite this, the man remained composed, handling each slight with an unbreakable calm. His quiet dignity only underscored the glaring disrespect he was being shown, making the contrast between his grace and her hostility all the more evident. His resilience, rather than easing the tension, seemed to intensify it, drawing more eyes and heightening the unspoken disapproval of those around him. The waitress, however, either didn't notice or simply didn't care about the whispers and glances. She was focused solely on her target, her attention narrowed in intent, her disdain unshaken by the awareness creeping into the room. To her, this was a private message, a punishment she felt justified in delivering, blind to the silent judgments gathering around her. Eventually, the waitress's passive aggression crossed the line into outright refusal of service. It was as though she had grown emboldened by her own actions, each slight building upon the last until she felt justified in her complete dismissal of him. She avoided his table entirely, choosing instead to cater to other patrons with exaggerated attentiveness, as though to highlight the contrast between how she treated them and how she deliberately ignored him. The man raised his hand politely to signal her attention, but she turned her head away, pretending not to see. When he tried to catch her eye as she passed by, she looked through him as if he were invisible, deliberately avoiding any acknowledgement. The other patrons could now clearly see the lengths she was going to in order to ignore him, and her disdain became impossible to ignore. At one point, when he finally managed to get her attention and asked if he might have some water, she responded with a cold, dismissive stare before turning on her heel and walking away without a word. Her blatant refusal to fulfill even the simplest request was an unspoken but unmistakable statement. She did not consider him worthy of even the most basic courtesy. Her actions shocked nearby patrons, some of whom exchanged uneasy glances or murmured in disbelief. The tension in the restaurant grew thicker, the discomfort among the guests palpable. They watched as he was left without even the most minimal gestures of service, no refilled glass, no cleared dishes, no polite inquiry as to whether he enjoyed his meal. Despite her attempts to humiliate him through this refusal of service, the man maintained his composure, his patience seemingly endless. His calm in the face of her open hostility only served to underscore her cruelty. It became clear to everyone observing that this was not a mere oversight or momentary lapse in attention. It was a deliberate choice, a pointed refusal born from prejudice. And though her message was loud and clear, it was she who now stood judged by the silent, watchful eyes of everyone around her. The waitress's disdain soon escalated to an unfounded and openly hostile accusation, a final attempt to assert her authority and humiliate him further. Emboldened by her previous actions and blinded by her prejudice, she decided to make a scene, hoping to draw attention to what she perceived as her right to question his place in the restaurant. Approaching his table with a hardened expression, she stood over him, arms crossed, her voice dripping with insincere politeness that barely masked her hostility. "Sir," she began, her tone louder than necessary, making sure that others in the room could hear, "I noticed you haven't ordered much. Are you sure you're able to cover the bill?" The question hung in the air, each word carefully chosen to cast doubt on his presence there, as if she were suggesting he didn't belong or couldn't afford the meal. Her gaze was cold and challenging, waiting for a reaction that would validate her assumption. The nearby patrons shifted in their seats, some gasping softly, appalled by the implication of her words. It was an insult that went beyond poor service, a calculated, unjust accusation meant to undermine his dignity. She looked down on him, convinced that this act would expose him as somehow unworthy of the restaurant's atmosphere, as if his mere presence tarnished the place. Despite the blatant provocation, the man looked up at her, his expression calm, though a hint of hurt flickered in his eyes. He didn't respond immediately, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. His silence only seemed to irritate her further, her frustration building as her accusation echoed unanswered. Nearby guests began to murmur, some casting reproachful glances at her, others looking at him with sympathy. Yet she ignored them all, too wrapped up in her conviction that she had finally exposed him. In her mind, she was justified, emboldened by a belief that she was defending the restaurant's standards. Her accusation was a final line she crossed, a cruel and baseless assumption that underscored the depth of her prejudice. The man's calm defiance in the face of her accusation seemed to shake the room, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Her words, intended as an insult, revealed more about her own biases than about the man sitting before her. The accusation had failed to humiliate him, but instead cast a harsh spotlight on her own injustice and cruelty. Unsettled by the man's unflappable calm, the waitress's frustration began to bubble over, pushing her beyond mere insults and cold treatment. She could feel the growing disapproval of other patrons, could sense their quiet judgment of her actions, but instead of backing down, she became more emboldened, as if doubling down on her behavior would somehow validate her prejudice. Her voice rose, loud enough now for the entire dining area to hear as she spoke, her words dripping with hostility. "You've barely touched your food," she sneered, her tone suggesting that his lack of appetite was somehow suspicious. "Are you planning on wasting our time here, or will you be leaving soon?" The guests in the nearby tables fell silent, their forks paused in midair, their eyes widening in shock at the audacity of her statement. The atmosphere in the restaurant grew tense, like the thick, charged air before a storm. Patrons exchanged nervous glances, some visibly uncomfortable, others seemingly waiting to see how he would respond to such an unwarranted attack. The man, maintaining his quiet dignity, raised his eyes to meet hers, his face expressionless but his gaze intense. He didn't speak, but his silence was more powerful than any words he could have chosen. The lack of reaction only further fueled her anger. She saw his calm as defiance, as a refusal to bow down to her authority, and it stoked something dark within her. She stepped closer to his table, her movements aggressive now, her voice hardening as she leaned in and continued her unwelcome commentary. "People like you think you can just come in here and act like you belong. But this place isn't for—" She caught herself just in time, but the implication in her tone was unmistakable. The words hung in the air, ugly and charged, conveying a meaning she didn't have to finish. The surrounding tables erupted in shocked whispers, the guests' expressions a mix of horror and outrage at her insinuation. Some patrons looked ready to intervene, their faces flushed with anger and discomfort. The man continued to sit calmly, his poise undisturbed even as her words cut deeper, her hostility bare and raw, with no attempt at subtlety anymore. It was now undeniable to everyone in the room that this was no ordinary conflict. It was a one-sided assault, fueled by her biases and emboldened by her unchecked prejudice. Her words and actions had escalated from passive hostility to open confrontation, revealing the full extent of her resentment and disregard for the man's dignity. The conflict had reached a fever pitch, her prejudice laid bare for everyone to see. Realizing her previous attempts to unsettle him had failed, the waitress's anger turned to pure venom. She was no longer hiding behind pretense or feigned politeness. Now, her words were sharp, meant to wound, her disdain evident to everyone around her. It was as if she believed that, by breaking his composure, she could finally assert her sense of superiority. With a scornful sneer, she leaned closer, her voice loud and mocking. "Do you even know what you're doing here?" she spat, her tone laced with contempt. "This isn't the kind of place for people like you." Her words, laced with the unmistakable sting of prejudice, hung heavy in the air, sending a wave of shock through the dining room. Several patrons gasped audibly, turning to one another with disbelief. What had been a simmering tension was now an undeniable, glaring act of open discrimination. Her words, laden with contempt and insult, crossed every line of decency. She no longer cared about the scene she was causing, as if her conviction had grown into an unhinged belief that this man deserved her mistreatment simply for existing in a space she didn't believe he belonged in. The man sat, silent but steady, his gaze fixed on her. He did not rise to her insults, his composure unwavering even as she cast one verbal dagger after another, each designed to provoke and humiliate. His calmness only seemed to enrage her further, and she felt a twisted need to strip away his dignity, to force a reaction from him. "Did you think coming here would make you feel important?" she taunted, her voice dripping with scorn. "Did you really think you'd be treated like the other guests?" Her laugh was sharp and cruel, echoing across the now silent restaurant. Her insult had left no room for doubt. It was personal, it was ugly, and it exposed the depths of her prejudice. The dining room, once filled with quiet conversations and gentle music, was now thick with tension and outrage. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, horrified by the waitress's outburst, yet riveted by the shocking display unfolding before them. Her words, designed to degrade and diminish, had backfired, leaving the patrons appalled and disgusted by her overt hostility. What she hadn't expected was that, in her attempt to shame him, she had only shamed herself, her cruel intentions fully exposed to everyone in the room. And still, the man remained composed, his silence a powerful rebuke to her baseless insults, a quiet dignity that spoke louder than her hateful words ever could. Driven by frustration at his silent resilience and emboldened by her unchecked anger, the waitress crossed yet another boundary, this time escalating to a level that shocked even those who had been watching in disapproval. Her contempt had boiled over into something dangerous, something desperate. She seemed to realize that her words alone weren't enough to provoke him, and, in her twisted sense of power, she felt compelled to take it a step further. With deliberate steps, she approached his table again, her jaw clenched, her movements stiff with contained rage. As she stood beside him, her eyes darted over his untouched plate, and with a flicker of cruel satisfaction, she seized his nearly empty glass, slamming it down on the table with unnecessary force. The sound echoed in the room, a jarring noise that drew the full attention of every patron in the restaurant. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and reached across the table, deliberately knocking over the small condiment dish. Its contents spilled messily onto the table, a blatant, almost childish act meant to ruin his dining experience. Her movements were harsh, her hands rough, and her intent clear. She wanted him to feel degraded, to show him that she held control in this space. She smiled bitterly, as if daring him to react. The man, still composed, barely flinched, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze that only seemed to fuel her anger further. Frustrated by his lack of response, she moved closer, brushing against his shoulder as she pretended to clear his table, each touch unnecessarily forceful, each motion intended to make him feel small and unwelcome. Her proximity was invasive, her actions escalating from verbal insults to physical intimidation, as if she needed to make her message impossible to ignore. The nearby patrons watched in stunned silence, their horror deepening as they realized she had moved beyond words. The room felt frozen, a collective tension mounting as everyone waited to see how far she would go. Her blatant disrespect had crossed into physical aggression, and the guests' faces reflected a mixture of disbelief, anger, and growing discomfort at her behavior. And yet, even in the face of this blatant physical provocation, the man remained unmoved, his quiet strength and unspoken defiance to her every attempt to humiliate him. His composure only emphasized the ugliness of her actions, leaving the room in silent condemnation of the waitress who had lost any semblance of professionalism, her prejudice laid bare for all to see. Determined to break his calm demeanor once and for all, the waitress decided to take things even further, pushing her cruelty under the guise of an accident. With a twisted sense of satisfaction, she glanced down at the glass of water on the tray she held, calculating her next move with chilling precision. Feigning a stumble, she moved toward his table, her hand strategically positioned over the glass. In one swift motion, she let the glass tip over, sending a cascade of cold water splashing across the table and directly onto the man's lap. The water spilled onto his clothes, soaking him as she let out a theatrical gasp, her expression feigning shock. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her tone laced with insincere concern, the mocking glint in her eyes betraying her true intentions. Her apology was barely convincing to anyone who had been watching, the exaggerated movements, the way she held the glass, all of it felt staged, a cruel display under the thin guise of an accident. The surrounding patrons gasped, some openly frowning at the waitress, their disbelief at her actions growing into open outrage. A couple seated nearby exchanged appalled glances, one of them muttering under their breath, "This can't be accidental." Her blatant disregard for the man's dignity was now painfully evident to everyone in the room. The man, still seated, looked down at his soaked clothing, his composure unshaken, though a subtle tension had settled into his posture. He took a slow breath, his face remaining calm, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. This silent strength, this refusal to bow to her open disrespect, made her act all the more grotesque in the eyes of the onlookers. The waitress, however, seemed undeterred by the judgmental stares around her. She smirked slightly, as if proud of her work, confident that she had finally found a way to visibly humiliate him. In her mind, the water was a message, a blatant declaration that he didn't belong here, a cruel reminder of her belief in her own superiority. Yet, her accident had only served to unmask her fully, revealing the depth of her prejudice to the entire restaurant. The crowd watched in silent outrage as the man reached for his napkin, quietly dabbing at his clothes, his dignity shining brighter even as her actions grew uglier. In that moment, it was clear to everyone, her cruelty had stripped her of any remaining respect, leaving her exposed and alone in her contempt. Emboldened by her twisted sense of victory, the waitress decided to take her contempt to an unprecedented level, pushing the situation to its most degrading point. She no longer felt the need to hide her intentions or pretend it was all just a series of unfortunate accidents. With an audience now fully aware of her hostility, she intended to deliver a final, undeniable blow to his dignity. Returning from the kitchen with a tray, she had arranged it in a way that betrayed her cruel intent. On it were scraps of leftover food, discarded bits that should have been cleared away or disposed of, remnants no longer fit for serving. But for him, she had decided it would be enough. With a smug, calculated smile, she approached his table, setting the tray down with a loud clatter, ensuring everyone's attention was on her. "Here you go," she said mockingly, her voice dripping with faux cheerfulness. "I thought I'd bring you something special since you seem to be enjoying your time here so much." The sarcasm was thick, the implication clear. She had no respect for him, no regard for his experience, and absolutely no hesitation in dehumanizing him before everyone present. She took one of the bowls of scraps and, in an almost ritualistic gesture, dumped it onto his plate, watching as bits of food mixed with cold sauce spilled across the dish in a chaotic, unappetizing mess. It was a blatant, humiliating display meant to strip away any last shred of dignity he might have held onto. Her smirk widened as she surveyed her work, waiting for his reaction, hoping to finally see him break. The surrounding patrons were horrified, some gasping openly, others looking away, unable to watch the cruelty unfolding before them. One or two seemed on the verge of intervening, but the scene was almost surreal, a nightmare of discrimination and hostility so profound that many simply couldn't believe it was real. The silence in the restaurant was deafening, every eye trained on the man and the waitress, caught between shock and outrage. And yet, in the face of this final, despicable act, the man remained seated, his calm unbroken. He looked down at the mess she had made, his hand steady, his gaze unwavering. His silence, his refusal to react, was a testament to his strength, a quiet defiance that made her cruel display look even more grotesque in contrast. The waitress, frustrated by his unyielding composure, fumed internally, realizing that her efforts to humiliate him had only underscored her own pettiness. She had given her all to reduce him, to assert her control, but instead, she had revealed the darkness within herself for all to see. In that tense, breathless moment, her so-called victory was laid bare as a hollow, shameful act, an ugly culmination of her prejudice that would haunt her long after the moment had passed. The final act of humiliation left the restaurant in a stunned silence, the weight of the waitress's actions sinking into every corner of the room. Patrons looked around in disbelief, their expressions mirroring a mixture of shock, horror, and indignation. What had once been a peaceful, refined atmosphere was now charged with the uncomfortable reality of what they had just witnessed, an act of cruelty so blatant that it felt almost unreal. People began murmuring among themselves, their voices tinged with outrage and disgust. Some shook their heads in disbelief, unable to comprehend how someone could behave with such open malice. Couples exchanged horrified glances, parents covered the eyes of their children, and others simply sat frozen, as if struggling to process the scene that had unfolded before them. The tension in the room was palpable, a collective condemnation of the waitress's behavior that hung in the air like a dense fog. One woman, her voice barely a whisper, muttered to her companion, "Did you see what she just did? How could anyone be so heartless?" Her words reflected the sentiments of many who were now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the weight of what they had witnessed settled in. The shock had turned to anger for some, the crowd beginning to bristle with indignation. Some guests were on the verge of speaking up, their hands clenched, their expressions filled with a moral outrage that demanded justice. A few patrons shot sympathetic glances toward the man, their eyes filled with an unspoken apology for having been mere witnesses to such an act of dehumanization. It was clear to everyone now that this wasn't just poor service or a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate, targeted display of hatred, an ugly manifestation of prejudice that left them all questioning their own complicity in remaining silent until now. The waitress, sensing the judgment radiating from every corner of the room, stiffened, her smugness faltering as she realized she was the object of the patrons' collective disapproval. What she had intended as a moment of triumph over her target had backfired, exposing her to the disdain and silent condemnation of everyone around her. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, could sense the disgust they felt toward her, yet her pride kept her from backing down. The man, meanwhile, continued to sit in dignified silence, embodying a quiet strength that only amplified the atrocity of her actions. The guests, now united in their outrage, found themselves in silent solidarity with him, their horror transforming into a shared resolve that such behavior could not be allowed to pass without consequence. Just when the tension in the room seemed almost unbearable, the man calmly rose from his seat. His every movement was deliberate, graceful, and quietly powerful, commanding the attention of everyone around him. The patrons watched with bated breath, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The waitress, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted uneasily as he turned to face her, his eyes calm but unwavering. With a steady voice, he spoke, his tone measured and resonant, carrying a strength that filled the room. "I think it's time for a formal introduction," he began, his words clear and unwavering, slicing through the silence. "I am the owner of this restaurant." The impact of his revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Gasps filled the air, eyes widened in disbelief, and murmurs rippled through the crowd as they processed what he had just said. The patrons exchanged stunned glances, their expressions a mix of astonishment and realization. The waitress, in particular, paled visibly, her smug expression fading into one of horror as the full weight of her actions came crashing down on her. She took a step back, her face twisting with a mixture of panic and disbelief. Her mind raced, grasping for excuses, for justifications, for anything that could erase the consequences she now knew were inevitable. Her entire demeanor changed in an instant, her confidence crumbling as she looked at the man with dawning fear. She had believed herself untouchable, wielding her prejudice as though it were a right, never suspecting that the very person she had scorned could hold her fate in his hands. The man continued, addressing both her and the stunned guests who had witnessed the ordeal. "This restaurant was built to be a place of warmth, respect, and community for everyone who walks through its doors. No one, regardless of who they are, should ever be treated the way I have been tonight." The guests listened intently, nodding in agreement, their own outrage blending with a sense of vindication as they watched the waitress's reaction. Her once confident expression was now twisted with fear and shame, her hands trembling as she realized the consequences that awaited her. Turning his gaze back to her, the man spoke with quiet authority, his words a final judgment. "Your actions tonight have shown a level of cruelty and prejudice that has no place here or anywhere." His tone left no room for argument, his words resonating with a sense of justice that seemed to speak for every person who had been appalled by her behavior. The waitress, realizing there was no escape, stammered, trying to form an apology, but her words fell flat, too insincere and too late to undo the damage she had caused. The man's calm, resolute stance made it clear that her apology was irrelevant now. She had already exposed herself, laid bare her cruelty, and now faced the full consequence of her actions. As the weight of his words settled over the room, the patrons began to applaud quietly, their collective approval of his response echoing through the restaurant. They looked to him with respect, their silent support affirming that his message had resonated with everyone. The waitress, meanwhile, stood frozen in humiliation, finally realizing that her prejudice and arrogance had led her to a place from which there was no return. As the reality of the situation sank in, the patrons who had witnessed the entire ordeal felt a mixture of satisfaction and awe. Whispers of recognition spread throughout the room as they began to piece together the full scope of what had just happened. The man who had sat so humbly, enduring the waitress's insults and contempt with grace, was, in fact, the very heart and vision behind the restaurant. His silent resilience, his calm in the face of her abuse, all of it now took on a deeper, more profound meaning. The surrounding staff, who had not known the full context of what was happening, began to gather closer, alerted by the hush that had fallen over the room and the quiet applause that had followed his words. They exchanged uneasy glances, some recognizing him as their employer for the first time, others realizing the gravity of the disrespect he had been shown. They understood that this was more than a simple reprimand. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would stay with them long after the night was over. The waitress, however, was still reeling, struggling to accept the truth she had only now come to understand. She stared at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror as the full weight of her actions bore down on her. Her mind raced, replaying each humiliating insult, each calculated act of disrespect, now knowing that every one of them had been aimed at the very person who had made her job possible, who had trusted her to represent his vision of hospitality and respect. As her shock turned to panic, she stammered, I didn't know. I didn't realize." Her words trailed off, hollow and meaningless in the face of her actions. The man's expression didn't soften. His eyes held a quiet strength, a mixture of disappointment and determination that left no room for her excuses. He had given her every opportunity to see beyond her prejudice, to treat him with basic decency, and she had failed every test. Turning to the gathered staff, he spoke calmly but firmly, making sure that everyone understood the gravity of what had happened. "Tonight, you all have witnessed a breach of the values we hold dear here. I created this restaurant as a place of respect and inclusion, a place where all guests are welcomed equally. That ideal has been violated." The other staff members nodded, visibly moved by his words, some looking at the waitress with expressions of disappointment and disapproval. They understood, as did the guests, that this moment was more than a mere reprimand. It was a statement of the standards he expected them all to uphold, a call to rise above prejudice and represent the true meaning of hospitality. The waitress, overwhelmed by shame and guilt, could barely meet his gaze. She had thought herself invulnerable, comfortable in her assumptions, only to find that the truth had stripped her of every bit of false superiority she had relied on. She was now completely exposed, her prejudice laid bare before her employer, her colleagues, and the guests she had alienated. In that moment, she finally understood the depths of her mistake. The truth had surfaced, and with it, any illusion of her dignity had been shattered. All that was left was the bitter realization that her actions had been seen, judged, and found severely lacking. With the truth now fully revealed, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from tense silence to an undeniable clarity. The guests, staff, and even the waitress herself were left to confront the stark reality of what had taken place. The man, standing tall and resolute, looked around the room, his presence commanding respect. His quiet strength had spoken volumes, exposing not only the cruelty of one individual but also reminding everyone of the values this place was meant to uphold. Turning back to the waitress, he addressed her directly, his voice calm but firm. "This restaurant," he began, "was never meant to be a place where anyone would feel unwelcome or judged. I built it to reflect respect, diversity, and dignity, qualities you have chosen to ignore tonight." His words were not angry, but they carried a weight that left no doubt about his disappointment. The waitress could barely lift her head, each word sinking in like stones, weighing her down with shame. She had spent the evening humiliating him, certain of her power and authority, only to realize that she had been abusing the trust he had placed in her. Her actions had not just affected him, they had tainted the very essence of the establishment she worked for, and everyone in the room was witness to that breach. The guests, who had initially been bystanders, now looked on with a newfound respect for the man and a clear understanding of the gravity of her transgressions. Some guests even nodded in quiet support, their approval reflecting solidarity with the owner and his ideals. They had come expecting a fine dining experience, but tonight they had been reminded of something much deeper, the importance of humanity, respect, and decency. The man then turned to the staff gathered around, his gaze softening slightly as he addressed them. Tonight was a lesson for us all. This place belongs to everyone who walks through its doors, and it is our responsibility to ensure that every guest feels valued. I trust each of you to uphold this vision, not just in words, but in every action. His words resonated deeply with the team, who nodded in agreement, absorbing the message that went beyond simple policy. It was a call to embody the very heart of hospitality. Then, looking once more at the waitress, he spoke the final words that would seal her fate. Your actions tonight have shown me that you do not share these values, that you are unwilling or unable to respect the people who come here in good faith. This behavior is unacceptable, and there is no place for it in this restaurant. His decision was delivered without anger, but with the clarity and authority that left no room for doubt. The waitress, understanding the consequences of her actions, finally bowed her head, her earlier arrogance now replaced by a stark realization of the gravity of her mistakes. She had lost more than just her job. She had lost the respect of her colleagues, the patrons, and, most of all, herself. As she walked out of the restaurant, the silence was profound, filled with the weight of the lesson everyone had just witnessed. The owner remained standing, his dignity intact, his quiet resilience a testament to his values. In that moment, he had not only restored the integrity of his establishment but had reminded everyone present of the importance of compassion and respect, principles that could not be compromised, no matter the circumstances. As the weight of her actions fully settled upon her, the waitress felt an overwhelming sense of regret and shame. Her arrogance, which had once shielded her from acknowledging the cruelty of her behavior, now crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. Realizing the damage she had caused, not only to the man but to herself and everyone who witnessed her actions, she took a hesitant step forward, her gaze lowered, her voice shaking with a newfound humility. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her words stumbling over each other in her desperation. Her voice, once full of scorn and mockery, was now quiet and fragile, barely more than a whisper. I didn't realize. I didn't know. I was wrong, terribly wrong. She tried to meet the man's gaze, but found herself unable to hold it, as the shame of her actions weighed heavily on her conscience. The sincerity in her voice, though genuine, was colored by desperation. She knew that an apology could not undo the hurt she had caused or erase the contempt she had shown him in front of everyone. Yet, in this moment, her words were the only means by which she could attempt to right her wrongs, however feeble the attempt might be. I don't know what I was thinking, she continued, her voice trembling. I let my own biases and assumptions control me. I misjudged you, and I was cruel. I can't believe I behaved like that. Each word felt like a confession, a painful acknowledgement of her prejudice, of the ugliness she had let dictate her actions. She looked around, meeting the disapproving gazes of her colleagues and the silent condemnation of the guests, each look reminding her of the respect she had lost. Turning back to the man, she managed to lift her head slightly, her eyes filled with a deep, conflicted remorse. Please, if there's any way, if you could forgive me. She pleaded, her voice breaking. But even she knew that forgiveness could not come so easily. Her words hung in the air, desperate and vulnerable, as she waited, hoping for a response, though knowing she didn't deserve one. The man regarded her in silence, his expression calm but unreadable. Her apology, though genuine, could not undo the deliberate cruelty she had inflicted upon him. He could see the regret in her eyes, the newfound awareness of the harm she had caused. Yet forgiveness was not something he could offer simply to ease her guilt. Her actions had left an indelible mark, a lesson that would stay with her and everyone who had witnessed the events of the evening. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured and compassionate but firm. "Apologies are a start," he said quietly, "but they cannot erase what has already been done. True change must come from within, and that is a journey you must take on your own." His words held both kindness and an understanding that went beyond forgiveness. They were a call for her to confront her biases and change, not for him, but for herself. The waitress nodded slowly, her face flushed with shame and a deep sense of realization. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that words alone could not absolve her. Her apology was a step, but it was only the beginning of a long path toward understanding and redemption. She turned, finally aware of the depth of her actions, knowing that tonight had changed her, but also left her with the responsibility to truly change within. As she walked away, the weight of her guilt was unmistakable, but so was the spark of awareness that had begun to grow in her. She had been exposed not only to others, but to herself, and that truth would linger long after she had left the restaurant. After the waitress's halting apology, the man took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful but resolute. He looked at her, his gaze penetrating but without malice, as though he were assessing her sincerity. The silence in the restaurant was profound, each person awaiting his response, sensing the gravity of the moment. They knew that whatever decision he made would set a precedent, not just for the waitress, but for the principles he stood for and the values he held dear. The man finally spoke, his voice calm yet filled with a quiet strength. "I appreciate your apology," he began, his tone measured and deliberate. "But an apology alone cannot undo the harm caused, nor can it erase the disrespect that has been shown, not just to me, but to every person who values dignity and respect." His words resonated with everyone in the room, a reminder of the weight of actions and the lasting impact they hold. He paused, allowing his message to sink in, before continuing. This restaurant was built on the foundation of equality, compassion, and acceptance. Tonight, those values were violated. Your actions were not just a personal affront, they undermined the very principles that we strive to uphold here. His tone held no anger, but the disappointment was unmistakable. Turning to address both the staff and guests, he made his decision clear. "I believe that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow," he said. "But with that chance comes responsibility. In this restaurant, there is no place for hatred, prejudice, or disrespect. Therefore, effective immediately, I am dismissing you from your position." His voice held a finality that left no room for doubt or debate. The waitress's face drained of color as his words sank in, her earlier plea for forgiveness fading into a stunned silence. She knew there was no argument to be made, no defense that could justify her actions. His decision, though firm, was not born of anger but of principle, a decision that reflected his unwavering commitment to the values he had built his restaurant upon. The man turned to her one last time, his expression softening slightly, as if to offer a final lesson. "This experience is yours to learn from. Take it as an opportunity to look within and understand the harm that prejudice can cause, not just to others, but to yourself. Redemption is possible, but it must be earned through actions that reflect true change." The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. The waitress nodded slowly, her expression one of deep regret and dawning self-awareness. Without a word, she gathered her belongings and walked toward the exit, humbled and forever changed by the lesson she had learned. As the door closed behind her, the man stood quietly for a moment, allowing the tension to dissipate. The patrons and staff watched him with respect and admiration, understanding that his decision was not merely about punishment but about upholding the values that made this place what it was. In that moment, he had reminded everyone present of the power of integrity, compassion, and the importance of standing by one's principles, even in the face of adversity. As the door closed behind the waitress, the room remained silent, charged with a mix of relief, admiration, and respect. The tension that had built throughout the evening slowly lifted, replaced by a sense of solidarity with the man who had quietly upheld his principles, even in the face of open hostility. The patrons exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting both amazement and a profound respect for the owner's strength and integrity. A few guests began to applaud softly, a quiet show of support that quickly grew into a collective expression of appreciation. The applause wasn't just for the man's decision, it was for his grace, his unwavering commitment to fairness, and the reminder of human dignity he had given everyone present. It was a rare and humbling moment that left the patrons deeply moved, as they recognized the power of his calm, principled stand against prejudice. Some guests looked at him with open admiration, murmuring to one another about the lesson they had just witnessed. "That was powerful," one man whispered to his companion, his voice tinged with respect. "He handled that with such grace. I've never seen anything like it." Another guest, a woman sitting near the door, shook her head, still processing the impact of the evening's events. "It takes real strength to respond like that," she said softly to the person next to her. "He didn't retaliate with anger, he led with dignity. That's the kind of world we need more of." Parents with children leaned down to quietly explain the significance of what had happened, turning the moment into an important lesson in empathy and respect. Young and old alike seemed moved, some visibly touched by the reminder of the values they hoped to pass on to future generations. As the applause faded, a few patrons approached the man to offer their personal thanks. One elderly gentleman, his voice filled with sincerity, shook the man's hand, saying, "Thank you. I'll remember this night for a long time. You've shown us what true character looks like." The man accepted their gratitude with a humble nod, offering a small, appreciative smile but saying little. His actions had spoken louder than any words could, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed the evening's events. The restaurant, which had felt fractured and uncomfortable only moments ago, now felt unified, bound by a shared respect for the ideals of kindness, equality, and justice. As the guests settled back into their meals, the air was filled with a renewed sense of connection, a warmth that seemed to ripple through the room. The man's quiet courage and steadfast principles had transformed the atmosphere, leaving everyone with a deeper understanding of the importance of compassion and the strength required to uphold it in the face of adversity. It was a moment none of them would soon forget. In the days that followed, the events of that evening continued to ripple through the restaurant industry and beyond, leaving a profound mark on the waitress's career and reputation. News of her actions, along with the owner's dignified response, spread quickly through local circles, reaching colleagues, potential employers, and patrons alike. The incident, witnessed by so many, had become a story of public record, one that highlighted not only her prejudiced behavior but also the lasting consequences of such cruelty. For the waitress, the impact on her career was swift and undeniable. She found herself met with resistance as she applied for new jobs, word had spread about her behavior, and prospective employers were hesitant to bring someone with such a blemished reputation into their teams. Some hiring managers, having heard the details of her actions, saw her as a liability, a risk to the atmosphere of respect and inclusivity they aimed to cultivate within their own establishments. Each job application came back with polite but firm rejections. Former colleagues who had once admired her work now distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the disgrace she had brought upon herself. Her peers in the industry had little sympathy, recognizing that her actions reflected a deep-seated prejudice that had no place in the service sector. Friends in the field had heard the story, and some even expressed disappointment, unable to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person she had revealed herself to be. Realizing the enormity of her mistake, the waitress attempted to seek out lower-profile work, hoping to escape the reputation that now followed her. But even those opportunities proved elusive, as each new employer would eventually hear of the incident, its story passed along by former patrons, staff members, or through whispers in the industry. Her name had become associated not with excellence or skill, but with an intolerance that had been exposed in the most public, humiliating way. Beyond the practical barriers to employment, she also faced the emotional consequences of her actions. She could not escape the memory of that evening, the faces of the guests she had scorned, and the silent condemnation she had felt from every person in the room. It was a bitter realization that the reputation she had worked years to build was now irreparably damaged by a single night's behavior. In time, the waitress began to understand that regaining any semblance of professional respect would require not only a shift in her actions, but a deep change in her own values. She knew that any hope of rebuilding her career would depend on her willingness to confront and uproot the biases she had allowed to dictate her actions. Only through genuine growth and accountability could she ever hope to restore her credibility, though she knew it would be a long and difficult journey. The lesson was harsh but necessary, and she was left to grapple with it alone, realizing that the path forward would require more than just words. It would demand transformation, self-awareness, and a commitment to change. And as her once promising career hung in the balance, she understood that true redemption, if it ever came, would be a personal journey, one that could not erase the past but might, in time, reshape her future. The incident became more than just a story of a single night's misdeeds. It evolved into a powerful narrative about justice, empathy, and the impact of one's choices. For everyone who had witnessed the events or heard of them later, it was a stark reminder of the values that should guide all human interactions, especially in places meant to welcome people from all walks of life. The restaurant owner's response served as a profound lesson, not only for his staff and patrons, but for the community as a whole. His choice to confront prejudice with dignity and unwavering commitment to justice set an example that resonated far beyond the walls of his establishment. Through his actions, he demonstrated that real strength lies in treating others with compassion and respect, even when faced with adversity and disrespect. In the restaurant industry, which so often revolves around appearances, profit, and public perception, his decision was a reminder that principles must come first. Other restaurant owners, inspired by his resolve, began revisiting their own policies and practices, aiming to reinforce an atmosphere of inclusivity and respect. Some even shared the story with their teams, using it as a teaching moment to emphasize the importance of kindness, patience, and empathy in every interaction. For the patrons who had been present, the evening became a defining moment, a testament to the power of quiet resilience in the face of prejudice. Many of them carried the memory of that night into their own lives, sharing it as an example with friends and family, especially with younger generations. Parents explained to their children the importance of treating everyone equally, and educators used the story to illustrate the impact of character and integrity. The waitress, now on a path of self-reflection, found herself faced with a harsh but transformative truth. The consequences of her actions had been just, and she could no longer hide from the prejudice that had driven her behavior. For her, the experience served as a wake-up call, an unflinching reminder of the harm that intolerance and judgment can inflict not only on others but on one's own spirit and future. She understood that she had a long road ahead, one that required humility, education, and a commitment to bettering herself if she ever hoped to rebuild her life and reputation. The lesson was clear to all: justice is not always served in the form of punishment or retribution. True justice, in this case, lay in the ability to turn a painful moment into an opportunity for growth, change, and understanding. It was a reminder that prejudice, no matter how subtle, is corrosive, and that dignity and respect should be the foundations of every interaction. The owner's choice to hold the waitress accountable while still offering her the possibility of learning and redemption demonstrated that even in the face of injustice, compassion and forgiveness can pave the way toward a more inclusive and understanding world. The restaurant, as a result, emerged stronger, its reputation fortified by the owner's principled stand. patrons returned with a renewed appreciation for the establishment, seeing it as not just a place for fine dining but as a beacon of the values they all aspired to embody. And so, a single night's ordeal became a lifelong lesson in the power of integrity, justice, and the enduring importance of kindness in all aspects of life. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant's atmosphere transformed, taking on a renewed sense of warmth, openness, and inclusivity that was felt by everyone who walked through its doors. The once subtle values of respect and dignity that the owner had envisioned were now openly celebrated, becoming the heart and soul of the establishment. Staff, guests, and even new patrons could sense the change. It was as if the restaurant itself had embraced a new commitment to honor and kindness. The owner took thoughtful steps to ensure that his vision would continue to guide every aspect of the dining experience. He held meetings with his team, discussing not only policies but also the deeper principles of empathy and respect that he wanted each person to embody. The staff was encouraged to share their thoughts and ideas on how to make the restaurant a place where every guest, regardless of background, felt genuinely welcome. This shift fostered a sense of unity and purpose among the employees, who now approached their work with a shared commitment to treating each guest with the same respect the owner had shown them. Team members who had witnessed the waitress's dismissal were profoundly affected by the lesson they had seen. They began to reflect on their own interactions, actively working to rid themselves of biases and prejudices, however small they might have been. They supported each other, exchanging reminders to maintain patience, kindness, and attentiveness with all patrons. The new sense of camaraderie and understanding permeated the restaurant, creating a harmonious work environment that only enhanced the guest experience. For the patrons, the change was just as noticeable. Regulars returned with a sense of pride in supporting a business that stood so firmly for values they respected, and newcomers often commented on the uniquely warm atmosphere they encountered. Guests felt not just served but valued. Interactions with staff were filled with authentic smiles and attentive service. Small touches, like warm greetings at the door and personalized care, became the norm, making each dining experience memorable for its genuine hospitality. Word of the restaurant's transformation spread throughout the community. Stories of the owner's response to prejudice and his dedication to integrity attracted new customers who wanted to experience the renowned atmosphere for themselves. The restaurant became known not just for its exceptional food and ambience, but for its commitment to humanity and equality, a place where people from all backgrounds could gather, connect, and enjoy a meal in an environment rooted in respect. The shift also extended beyond the walls of the restaurant. Local businesses and other restaurant owners were inspired by his example, adopting similar practices and prioritizing inclusivity within their own teams. The restaurant had become a symbol of positive change, reminding the community that businesses could play a significant role in fostering compassion and unity. Over time, the restaurant flourished, its success a testament to the values it stood for. The atmosphere became one of warmth, kindness, and community, a haven for people to feel seen and appreciated. For the staff, the guests, and the owner himself, the experience served as a reminder that dignity, respect, and open-heartedness were not just values to aspire to, they were the foundation of every truly meaningful interaction. And in this restaurant, those values weren't just ideals, they were the very essence of the place, breathed into life by everyone who entered. In the end, the story of that fateful evening became more than just a memory. It transformed into a lasting legacy of change, respect, and human decency. What had started as an isolated incident of prejudice blossomed into a powerful lesson that would impact everyone involved for years to come. For the owner, the experience was a reaffirmation of the values he had always hoped his restaurant would embody. His response to the situation had not only set a powerful example, but also brought his vision to life in a way that resonated deeply with his staff, his patrons, and the wider community. He had shown that integrity and compassion, when practiced even in the face of hostility, can create ripples of change far beyond the immediate moment. His restaurant had grown into a beacon, a place where people felt welcomed, valued, and respected, regardless of who they were. The waitress, on her own difficult path of reflection and growth, was left with a lasting lesson in humility and self-awareness. She had been forced to confront her own biases, the harm they had caused, and the repercussions they had wrought on her life and career. Her journey was a reminder that true change requires looking inward and dismantling prejudices that can often go unnoticed. Her story became a cautionary tale for others in the industry, illustrating the importance of treating every person with dignity, no matter their background or appearance. For the staff, the incident deepened their understanding of their role as ambassadors of kindness and hospitality. They realized that they had the power to make every guest feel seen and valued, and this awareness brought a new level of purpose to their work. They saw that they were part of something greater, a commitment to kindness that made a difference in people's lives and left a lasting impact. The patrons who witnessed the incident and those who heard of it afterward took away their own lessons, sharing the story with friends and family. It became an example of how prejudice can rear its head in unexpected places and how, in the face of discrimination, grace and integrity can be the most powerful responses. For them, the restaurant became a place of meaning, a symbol of the values they aspired to uphold in their own lives. In time, the story became part of the restaurant's history, retold with pride by regulars, shared by new patrons, and passed on as a reminder of the importance of human connection and decency. The restaurant itself continued to thrive, not just as a place of fine dining but as a cherished community hub where people of all backgrounds could gather and feel welcome. In the end, the events of that evening left a lasting mark, a testament to the strength of character, the power of justice tempered with compassion, and the reminder that each of us has the capacity to make a difference. The restaurant stood as a living example of what could be achieved when integrity and humanity guide our choices, proving that true success isn't measured only by profit or popularity, but by the respect, warmth, and inclusivity we create in the spaces we share. Friends, what do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know if you've ever experienced racism or injustice in your life. Your stories and perspectives are incredibly important to us. Each one of you means so much to our channel. Be sure to subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Your support and engagement help us continue sharing meaningful stories that connect us all. Thank you for being here, and may your day be filled with kindness and respect for everyone around you.